We're pleased to have with us former professor of physics at MIT, Dr. Jeremy England, author of Every Life is on Fire, currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. Dr. England.
Thanks very much. So we're just a few days out from Hag Pesach, and I thought I would try to discuss today a theme that, in one sense, isn't directly about Pesach, but it is connected with the life of Moshe Rabbeinu and the events described in Sefer Shmot, in the passages in the book of Exodus leading up to when Moshe is tasked with leading Bnei Israel out of Mitzrayim. And it's really, at the end of the day, trying to be a discussion about a broader theme that I think once you notice it coming to its culmination, in a sense, in the life of Moshe, you can trace the thread backward and realize that this is a topic that really comes up over and over again throughout Sefer Bereshit and then running into Sefer Shmot. And in another sense, it makes sense that it should be an important theme. It's a theme that's very big. It's a theme about power dynamics that are both, on the one hand, political, and on the other hand, about relationships between men and women. So, when you describe it in those terms, it suddenly sounds like, wow, that's a whole lot of the human condition. So it's perhaps not surprising that it would be a very big theme that runs through a lot of different passages we have in Torah. But I think the jumping off point for the discussion, it doesn't have to be the place we begin, but I think it may as well be, is just to make the following observation about Moshe, which I think many people have made before. And that is that Moshe Rabbeinu is the product of the efforts of many different women, right? Moshe Rabbeinu becomes the leader of Bnei Israel, the prophet, and in a sense, the king of the Israelite nation, who will lead them for 40 years through the Midbar and bring them to the promised land after taking them out of slavery with signs and wonders and all of that, and doing that at the behest of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He is this unique figure of great significance and representing all of this might and the closest thing we have in a human being to a person who represents the triumph of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's will over the laws of nature, right? That he's just surrounded by wonders, and Moshe is the most larger than life personality we have at some level in all of Tanakh, and it's all a pivot that sort of swings around him as a fulcrum. But if you look at the life of Moshe and how it begins, it is interesting to note that much more so than I think anyone else that one can think of in Tanakh, he is created by the separate efforts of many different women who are named and whose contributions to his creation or bringing him into being and making him who he is, all gets separately noted. So we can just like run off in rapid fire and make a list. So obviously first, it seems like we should talk about Yocheved, his mother. But even before that, you might argue that you could go back even further, that before the case of Moshe specifically is mentioned, we also have the idea of Paro trying to destroy all of the boys, the baby boys of the Ivrim, and the midwives, the Hebrew midwives or the midwives to the Hebrews, Shifra and Pua, are named and described and heroized in a sense for refusing to do Paro's will and to kill all of the Hebrew baby boys. And that is what triggers Paro's demand that instead the baby boys be thrown into the Yaor, into the Nile. So really, Shifra and Pua are also part of the story because their refusal to cooperate with Paro is part of what created the circumstances by which Moshe became who he was as well. So we start with Shifra and Pua, and then we come to Yocheved, his mother, and how she hides him from Paro for as long as she can, and then she eventually puts him in this teva, this basket or ark of reeds that she places in the river, and so she is doing the best she can to take care of him. Although, as a side note, I think it's interesting to realize about that moment that she was obeying the law, right? We don't usually think of that in those terms, but the law was that, Paro said that the baby boys of the Ivrim have to be thrown in the river, and she put him in the river. She didn't try to, send him away somewhere, right? She was actually complying in a sense, and so her action is very interesting in that regard, because it is coming as close as possible to doing what's being asked, while also trying to just shave that extra millimeter of difference away by not just tossing him in the river to the crocodiles, but instead putting him in the teva, which makes all the difference, right? But it only makes the difference because she has the emunah to hope that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will multiply that tiny difference that she puts into some greater outcome. And I think that may be part of what actually Chazal are getting at when they refer in a midrash about the same set of events to the next step, where Bat Paro, the daughter of Paro, finds the basket, and she couldn't reach it in the water. And Chazal say that her arm extended, all the way out to grab the basket out of the water. That there was a miraculous kind of reach of her arm that was beyond what it should have been, that allowed her to grab it. And it, I think, is reflecting what happened with Yocheved, in a sense, that the same way that putting a baby in a basket and pushing it out into the Nile seems, practically speaking, to be the same thing as just tossing him into the water for the crocodiles. And the tiny difference there seems like it's inconsequential. But because HaKadosh Baruch Hu can make up the difference and can cause small differences to become very large ones when he chooses, there was actually a miraculous way in which Yocheved's seemingly insufficient capability or effort was enough to make the difference. And then that's reflected in this image of Bat Paro, in the opposite way, where it's as though her arm is seemingly insufficient, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes it sufficient. So that's possibly an aside, but I think what it's showing partly is that in the understanding of Chazal, there is a connection between Yocheved and Bat Paro, in that they're part of this chain of women who are doing things that they don't seem like they're enough. Shifra and Pua refuse to cooperate with Paro, and Paro just says, okay, so we'll kill the baby boys of the Ivrim a different way. But that diverts things, to another set of events. And then now suddenly we're dealing with the river, and then there's the basket, and then Bat Paro finds Moshe, and she's there with her maids, which is also, more women who are involved in the picture. And Miriam, the sister of Moshe, shows up to make sure that Moshe gets reconnected with his mother. And so she talks to Bat Paro and intervenes. So you have all these different women, all the way up to the point where Moshe now becomes this prince of Egypt, right? He's raised in the palace, and also has connection with his people. And then it still goes on, because then eventually he runs away from Mitzrayim. And when he runs away from Mitzrayim, he encounters the daughters of Yitro at the well in Midian, and he saves them from the shepherds. And as a result, he ends up marrying Tzipporah, and Tzipporah then saves his life on the way back to Mitzrayim with this event with the Brit Milah. And so just, when you lay it end to end, Shifra, Pua, Yocheved, Bat Paro, and Miriam, and also maybe the maids of Bat Paro, and also maybe the sisters of Tzipporah and Tzipporah herself, it's this huge number of women. And there's this head of steam that's building up behind Moshe to kind of launch him into existence as this totally unique and singular figure who will play this one-time role for Am Yisrael, and therefore also for humanity, in the kind of establishment of relationship between humankind and HaKadosh Baruch Hu that's required, because he ultimately represents this encounter at Har Sinai. So that could be something you just observe, and then say, all right, that's a nice positive message that even though Moshe is a man, that he is all the more so or not all the more so, but that he is much more so than many great men, perhaps, a product of the efforts and moral heroism of many women. And the Torah wants to especially underline that for us so that we don't think of Moshe as being self-made, and we don't think because he's a man that there isn't any great difference to Jewish history or to world history, that a more feminine element in the narrative could make. And all of that, I think, is an important point. But I think it also raises a different kind of question, which is, are there things about relationships between men and women, and are there, let's say, elements that repeat themselves in the typical dynamics of interactions between men and women that the Torah is trying to teach us about, which this moment is actually referent to? That's a kind of question that we can ask. Like, is it just a singularity in the life of Moshe? And it's just trying to make a point to us about Moshe, a sort of a feminist subtext of some kind underneath the establishment of Moshe as the figure who will be, the central figure of the rest of the Torah? Or if we go back in time from that point, if we look at Sefer Bereshit, before all of this that's happening in Mitzrayim with Moshe, do we see other elements in the text that really connect to this? And it's clear I'm going to argue that the answer to that question is yes. And there may be many ways you could start to try to answer this question. And I don't even think that, everything that I'm going to say is going to exhaust this, because a whole lot of what Sefer Bereshit is about in one way or another is about the dynamics of interaction between men and women. And we're not going to cover all of it. But there's a particular point that I think is maybe best illustrated in the final event that we just described, that sort of finishes, or let's say not the final event, but the final woman who completes Moshe is Tzipporah. And the way that Moshe encounters Tzipporah has to do with this moment where he's coming to the rescue of her and her sisters. And that is a moment for us to grab onto and think about, and then now ask ourselves about what we can understand in Sefer Bereshit in light of that. So now I want to roll all the way back to the beginning, or near the beginning. Let's say not all the way back to the beginning, but near the beginning of Sefer Bereshit, and refer to a curious passage that I think we often read differently, or are not sure how to read because it's so bizarre. It's in Perek Vav of Sefer Bereshit, and it comes at the end of Parshat Bereshit. Before we get the whole story with Noach, there's this curious passage about what's sometimes called the divine being. So it's Vayehi ki yahel ha'adam larov al pnei ha'adama uvanot yuldu lahem. And it came to pass when men began to multiply in the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. Vayir'u v'nei ha'Elohim, Vayir'u v'nei ha'Elohim et benot ha'adam ki tovot hena vayikhu lahem nashim mikol asher baharu. That the son. So now this is the question of how to translate this. Sometimes B'nai HaElohim is translated as the divine beings, but we'll just say B'nai HaElohim saw the daughters of men that they were pretty, and they took as wives all those whom they chose. And then we don't even need to dwell in, or at least I'm not going to make much out of the subsequent psukim that describe the consequences of that event. But I think that passage describing B'nai Elohim taking these daughters for themselves, that's the thing that we're going to try to understand a little better. And I want to propose a different way of reading it than we sometimes do, which is to say, I think there's this tendency to read B'nai Elohim and to see in that phrase a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that immediately means that it must be referring to someone or something that is not earthly. And there's support in Tanakh for that, because when the heavenly assembly that's engaging in this sort of play at the beginning of Sefer Eov, for example, where the Satan is talking with HaKadosh Baruch Hu about Eov, when it's assembled, they're referred to in that way, and it sounds like, oh, okay, so it must be a whole sort of parliament of angels or something like that. But there's a different way we could run with this, which I think ends up explaining a lot of, or ends up being referenced suddenly to a whole lot of other passages that come subsequently in Sefer Bereshit, which is to take note of the following. The word ha-Elohim sometimes in the Torah does not refer to the divine, right? Sometimes it refers to the gods when it's on the lips of pagans in Canaan, for example. Sometimes it refers to HaKadosh Baruch Hu at various points, let's say in Gan Eden or elsewhere, maybe talking about Ma'amad Har Sinai, for example. But sometimes it refers to judges, or let's say powerful potentates, because the ultimate grammar of the word is just, it's referring to the idea of those with power. And for example, when Eved HaIvri, when the Hebrew slave who doesn't want to go free from his master is going to have his, an awl pushed through his ear and all of that stuff that's described at the beginning of Parshat Mishpatim, the pasuk that instructs us in how to deal with that situation refers to Beit Din, like the court, the court of Jewish law to which he must be brought. It's referred to as bringing him before Elohim also. And so in that moment, that word may be just an epithet for people here on earth who have power. And so we could look for other examples in the Torah itself and elsewhere where the word is being used that way. Why do I think that's important? I think it's important because it gives us the opportunity to look at this passage and say, okay, well, maybe what's being talked about here is, it's not Beit Din, obviously, because there's no Beit Din yet. This is very early on. This is before Noach. But it is talking about powerful people who might just be men, right? People on earth who are powerful. So Bnei Elohim is the sons of the powerful, right? Who are they? They're like princes, for example. So the sons of the powerful are princes who feel that, the world is their oyster because they have an army at their back. They're the rulers of the land, and they can go out and they can find beautiful women for themselves and take them as wives, right? And once you think about that, you can just say, oh, well, I've heard of that before. That's all over the place. That is a theme that is just appearing over and over and over again, not just in Sefer Bereshit, but throughout Tanakh. For example, when on the one hand, let's say David HaMelech takes Bathsheba, or when Achashverosh takes Malkat Esther for his wife, right? So it's just regular everyday business in the ancient world that you have powerful men, they see beautiful women, and they decide they want to take them for wives. And really, in Sefer Bereshit, you suddenly realize it's even more a very deliberate and specific theme, right? Starting, for example, or maybe I shouldn't say starting, but certainly we notice it very clearly, for example, when Avram goes down to Mitzrayim, right? He arrives in Canaan with Sarai. Shortly afterwards, they go down to Mitzrayim. There's this whole interlude where he says, please tell them that you're my sister, because he's afraid of what will be done to him. Because what? Powerful men will see her beauty and want to kill him and take her. And then what Paro does is he sees her beauty and he does take her, and then they have to be set free. And this happens to Avram again, right? When they go to Gerar, now he's Avraham and she's Sarah, and Avimelech, king of Gerar, takes Sarah into his harem, and then she has to be liberated again. This almost happens again to Yitzchak Avinu, again in Gerar with Avimelech. And I think we often think that the story stops there, but really I would argue for another passage that is maybe even easier in some sense to connect to the language here in this source about Bnei Elohim, which is a continuation of the same theme, but we miss it because it's about a sister, but it's not about someone pretending to be a sister. It's about someone who actually is a sister. Well, I guess technically Sarai or Sarai Menu also was a sister or a half sister, but you get the idea. So who is someone's sister? Dina, the daughter of Yaakov, is the sister of all the brothers, right? So the 12 sons of Yaakov. And Dina is out in the field, right? When they're camped out near Shechem, and who should see her but Shechem, who is the prince, right? The son of Hamor, who's the king of Shechem. And so he is not just a powerful man, right? But he even fits the description of Bnei Elohim even better. He's the son of the king. The son of the king, he sees a woman he likes, and he feels that it's within his right and his power to take her. And so he desires her, he takes her, and he takes her against her will. And then afterwards, there's maybe the suggestion that I don't know if we want to say in love with her, but at least that he decides that he wants to keep her. And there's this negotiation with Yaakov Avinu and that ultimately ends in violence, right? Because Shimon and Levi, the sons of Yaakov, play this trick involving Brit Milah, where they get everyone in the city of Shechem to perform Brit Milah themselves, argue, supposedly as the basis for some kind of treaty or of a friendship and intermarriage, and then they go in and they kill everyone and they liberate Dina. And so I think that in that passage, we have to notice here that there's an opportunity that we're being offered to expand the model from what was being established with Abraham and Yitzchak, and see this as a more general phenomenon that has different dimensions that play out in different ways, right? So instead of it always being that there's a man and his wife, and someone tries to take his wife, and they because they're pretending, while they're pretending to be brother and sister, that the passage is changing things and saying, well, now, what if it is someone's sister? Is it okay to take someone's sister? Dina wasn't, as far as we know from the text, married to anyone. She was just someone's sister. And so that is the scenario that Avraham was trying to simulate in Mitzrayim. But now in this scenario, it seems like we're still being asked to examine this question and say, how do we feel about this? Is this such a bad thing? And clearly Shimon and Levi and the brothers are of the opinion this is still, a terrible thing. And they say, shall our sister be made into a zonah, to a prostitute? So they're getting violent about this because they're saying this can't be the way of the world. And even if she's just someone's sister, you still can't take her and treat her this way. And so what is this adding up to? I think that what we end up seeing is a thread that starts with this first passage talking about Bnei Elohim, and it's going to run down through Sefer Bereshit, and there are these variations on the same theme where you have the idea of a powerful man, a king or a prince, who's trying to take a woman for himself. But the versions aren't identical. And I think that this is now the interesting thing. They seem to represent a progression. They seem to represent even what you might call a certain kind of progress. Because, and you see that most clearly in how things play out with Dina, because Dina is not exactly the same model as before because she is someone's sister. So let's think about, how these events play out one by one. With Avram and Sarai, when they go down to Mitzrayim, Paro takes Sarai, and then there are makot, as the text describes. There are blows struck by Hakadosh Baruch Hu against Paro, and then he sets her free, and she and Avram go free. So there you have this very unapologetic kind of violent taking of Sarai, and then it requires a kind of violence against Paro to set him, Sarai free. With Avimelech, when it happens again in the life of Avraham Avinu, it's very similar, but it is a little bit different because there's this idea that, well, Avimelech is also a Navi, like he also is capable of hearing that something is wrong in what he's done from HaKadosh Baruch Hu in his dream. And then Avram explains himself in this dialogue to Avimelech saying, well, the reason I played this trick on you is because there's no fear of God in this place. There's no Yirat Elohim in this place. And that already is a kind of a progress in a way, because suddenly the idea of whether HaKadosh Baruch Hu disapproves of this kind of behavior is a subject for discussion, even if actually Avimelech's society is corrupt and not trustworthy. And in practice, he did to Avraham more or less the same thing that Paro did. There's suddenly more of a language that they have for talking about whether or not it is acceptable to treat women this way, or to treat men and women this way, right? Like a married couple, and basically make people fear for their lives because someone's going to kill them to take their wife. And when you go down to Yitzchak Avinu coming back to Gerar in the next generation, you see that it's again not the same, right? Now, it isn't even the case that Avimelech takes takes Rivka from Yitzchak. They start out with the same thing where Yitzchak says to Rivka, tell him that you're my sister, or tell everyone that you're my sister. And then Avimelech doesn't take her. He comes and it says that he spies Be'ad Chalon. He's looking through the window and he sees Yitzchak mitzachek. He's cavorting with his bride, and he can tell that they're married and they're not just brother and sister. And so he was somehow checking. He was trying to make sure that he wasn't doing the wrong thing, that he had right information, that there was more Yirat Shamayim in the Avimelech of the time of Yitzchak than there was in the time of Abraham. So the world is slowly changing bit by bit. And by the time you get up to when Yaakov Avinu comes to Eretz Canaan, and again, the next generation with his whole family, it's not Rachel who is in danger from the king of Shechem. There's no discussion of that. It's Dina, who is the unmarried daughter of Yaakov. So that in previous generations was the thing they were trying to simulate. They were saying, let's pretend we're brother and sister, so at least they won't kill me, since I'm actually your husband and we're married. And now we get down to a daughter who's unmarried, and the text is asking, okay, so Nana, what do we think about this? Is it okay for Shechem to kidnap and essentially rape and take by force as his wife Dina just because she isn't married yet? Or do we have a problem with this? And here Shimon and Levi are representing a perspective. They're the next generation saying, no, even this is unacceptable. Even this is an outrage, and we should go to war over it. And so you're seeing generation by generation that things are changing, and they're moving in a particular direction. They're moving in the direction of, let's say, a widening circle of kinds of women who should, in some sense, be protected under the law from the arbitrary depredation of powerful men who think they should be able to take for themselves whatever women they see or want if they have the force or the power to do it. And we also see perhaps that the imposition of that message about the widening circle is really happening as a result of the presence and impact of the families of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, right? That they are the message bearers. They are the ones transforming the world, that they came into a world in which Paro acted this way, or in which Avimelech acted this way. And they have these encounters and these interactions, and then generation by generation, they're bearing the message of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world, down through what Shimon and Levi eventually insist on as well. And they're kind of convincing the world that started from a state of nature in which powerful men could take from, whatever beautiful daughters in the world that they found. They're convincing the world bit by bit that this isn't the only way that the world has to operate. And then actually it's possible for there to be a world in which perhaps someone like Dina could go for a walk without expecting to be kidnapped and raped. But it's also showing us how difficult that is, and how the fundamental and, let's say, nearly animal initial state of humankind is one where there is this imbalance of physical power between men and women. And also, if in addition you have this imbalance of physical power sometimes between different men, so that, one man is a king and he has an army and another one doesn't, that women were not protected by default in that setting. And that was something that had to emerge and develop over time. And I think there's a last proof of this, that the text is trying to get at this a little bit, that now with this whole idea, we can go back and look for and find in the text in kind of a funny place where I think it's hard to notice it without these other passages. So there's this curious passage at some point when it's in the genealogy of Cain, the son of Adam and Chava, where going down through, subsequent generations, there eventually is a descendant of Cain whose name is Lamech. And there's this point where Lamech is talking about how he's very violent and he beats people up for hurting him. And it says, Vayomer Lamech lineshav Ada Vasila Shim'an Koli Nishe Lamech Ha'azena Imrati Ki Ish Haragti Lefitz'i V'Yeled Lechaburati Ki Shiva'atayim Yukam Kain V'Lemech Shiva'im V'Shiva'a. So what does he say? He says, Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Sila, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech, listen to my speech, for I have slain a man for wounding me and a young man for hurting me. And if Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. So this is one of those classic kind of snippets of Sefer Bereshit where we can read it a million times and it can just kind of be a puzzle or a detail where we're not sure what it's talking about or why it's there. But I think that the theme that we're pulling on right now and threading through different passages in Sefer Bereshit helps us to understand it. Why? Because first of all, I think I can't help noticing this phrase, Shima'an Koli. This is a strange way for him to be saying to his wives, listen to my voice. So the grammar of talking to this plural feminine group of two women allows him to say Shima'an, which is very much like Shimon, right? The brother of Dina. And then Shima'an Koli, and this is maybe more of a stretch, but the word Koli has all the letters of the word Levi in it. It's a kuf and then Vav Lamed Yud. So right here together, you have Shimon and Levi and a kuf. And so that's maybe a bit of a cryptic attempt at drawing a connection, but really the thematic connection is more obvious. What is he saying? He's saying to his women that he is very powerful. And what that means is that if someone even, just irritates him, then he can kill them. So this is underlying the disproportion of what you get when you have amassed political power, that if you sort of threaten the president, then you go to jail or worse, even though, he could threaten you and nothing, so much would happen to him. That there's this asymmetry where leaders can amass power and suddenly, even if you start to show that you don't agree with, what they're saying, then they in principle have the power to crush you. And that's part of what's being referred to here. And even his name Lamech is really the letters with which you spell Melech, right? King. It's kind of referring to the emergence of political order following the beginning of the line of Cain. That it's describing from a certain perspective how humankind starts to aggregate power together in a way that began with Cain, perhaps, and it's the mark of Cain, that Cain was concerned with protecting himself, and the way you protect yourself from danger is by having a whole bunch of other people help to protect you. And so Lamech is this kind of bigger, exponentially larger version of that. And he's saying, if someone even sneezes at me, I can have them killed. And so I'm an even bigger deal than Cain, because even more disproportion of violence is visited upon anyone who threatens me. And now what is all the point of this? What does this have to do with the women? Why does this have to do with Shimon and Levi, I would argue? The reason I think it has to do with Shimon and Levi is because what are the names of his wives? The names of his wives are Ada and Tzila. So Ada has the word ed in it, like a witness. And Tzila sounds like the word lehatzil, which means to save, right? So to be saved by a witness is, I think, the thing that we should be asking ourselves about. How can a witness save someone? A witness can save someone if there's political order, right? Because if there's political order, then that means the fact that there are witnesses means that the king can come and crush you for something you do later, even though he's not here right now. So might making right is the sort of, let's say, state of nature, initial condition of humankind, where if you're strong enough, then you see a woman that you like, you should be able to kill all the men around her and take him for yourself. But what this is now pointing to is a new condition involving kingship and political order, where, and perhaps courts and laws, where witnesses can be a danger to anyone because they can get them in trouble for breaking the law. And this moment is being connected with these wives of Lamech, I would argue, because this is about women also. It's about how a fundamental way in the progress of humankind throughout history that women have become safer, despite the fact that they are typically less physically powerful than the men who might seek to kidnap and rape them, etc. Is that humankind has developed mechanisms of political order that make it so that the weight of the state, so to speak, or the sword of the king is going to go after someone who breaks laws, which means now, even if there's one witness or two witnesses or what have you, then you have to think twice about doing this, even if you actually have the physical balance of power in the time and the place where you are. So, that in one sense, it's just a general statement. And it's just interesting to note that the Torah is making this comment on the evolution of political order and how it impacts the condition of women. But I think that the way we complete this and trace it back through to what we started off by talking about with Moshe Rabbeinu is just to say, I think that this is starting to show to us that Moshe Rabbeinu is a kind of a tikkun or a reparation for what happens with Dina, in a sense. Like, it's an expiation of something that what was a problem or a failure that needed to be corrected, and that took a very long time to correct, in some sense, because there is a sense in which you could argue that Yaakov Avinu and his family were getting ready to become a nation in Eretz Canaan at this moment when they were setting up camp in front of Shechem. The Midrash tells us about how Yaakov Avinu was minting coinage, and he was trying to set up shop next to a city or a nation or a city state that it seemed like maybe it was possible to deal with. And there, even after the rape of Dina, still there's this flirtation with the idea that they're still going to intermarry with them and kind of become a nation together with the people of Shechem. And then Shimon and Levi take things sharply in a different direction by killing all the men in Shechem. And the question is, where was the real failure there? I think some people might argue the failure was with Shimon and Levi choosing to be violent in the way they were, but I'm not so sure of that, because I think that in the observations that we've been making about the text up until this point, I would argue what they might point towards instead is the idea that the failure really was in what happened to Dina, right? That there was some sense in which she wasn't being looked after properly or properly protected. That whether we're talking about, Yaakov Avinu and the brothers and the family structure and everything that was in place there, or the state of the world in general, the point is that it wasn't actually safe for Dina to be going out and doing visiting in the way that she was. seeing, Penot Haaretz, the daughters of the land. And because people didn't make a safe enough situation for her, that triggered this set of events that destroyed the possibility of creating a nation out of Bnei Yisrael in that moment in time in Eretz Canaan. And that really was the beginning of the end, right? It was the beginning of the selling of Yosef down into Mitzrayim, and everything that happened afterwards, because there's all of this, the moment when Yosef is about to be sold by his brothers. He's going to look for them in Shechem, and they're not in Shechem, they're somewhere else called Dotan. And when he's told by this person he meets in the field, like Dina was in the field, right? That he meets someone in the field who says, oh, they're not in Shechem, they're in Dotan. The word that's used is Dotania, because it's like the grammar of going to a place. So Dotania, interestingly, is, again, another one of these words where it's the name of Dina plus a taf, right? So there's a taf in the middle of it, but it's Dina. There's this reference to the idea of Dina. What does it have to do with Dina? I think Chazal pick up on this, because what they tell us in a midrash is that the wife of Yosef HaTzadik, when he went down to Mitzrayim, who was Osnat bat Potifera, right? Who we're told in the Torah was this woman who was the daughter of some priest in Mitzrayim. That the Torah, the Midrash picks up on this and says, Potifera is Potifar, who was the slave owner he was the master of Yosef, and he rescued the child of Shechem and Dina that was abandoned at the walls of Mitzrayim. And then Osnat, his daughter, was therefore the daughter of Dina. And so the daughter of Dina ends up as this daughter of a mighty person in Mitzrayim, the adopted daughter, and can therefore grow up and become the wife of Yosef HaTzadik. And what's interesting about that midrash is that what it is ultimately doing lineally is it's establishing 13 tribes, right? Ephraim and Menashe are going to come from Yosef. So there are 13 tribes. But if Osnat is the daughter of Dina, then that means that Ephraim and Menashe are not just descended from Yosef, they're also descended from Dina. So we have 13 children of Yaakov and 13 tribes. And we get the extra tribe because of the recapture of the line of Dina. So this comment by this midrash is, I think, underlining this idea that there was some kind of neglect being shown to Dina about her well-being or her share in the future of the nation that was being built. And that mistake may have been the beginning of this 400-year-long time that nation building had to happen, not in Canaan as it might have with Shechem, but instead in Mitzrayim, in slavery, because the people weren't ready in a sense and had to incubate there. And then ultimately Moshe from Shevet Levi, which is one of the brothers who fought for Dina's honor, he has to come along. And what's the thing he does that seals him as the leader of Bnei Yisrael, where he's going to encounter HaKadosh Baruch Hu at Har Sinai in Midian? He sees women who belong to some other nation. He doesn't even know them, but he sees women who are vulnerable at the hands of men, of shepherds, who are being rough with them and trying to take advantage of them. And he rescues them, right? He uses his strength to save these vulnerable women. And that is this last moment that seals Moshe as the one who's going to go to Har Chorev, which he'll do now that he's become part of Midian. By the way, Midian is another name that has this root, Din, Dalet Yud Nun, like the name of Dina, and also it's referring to judgment in the law. So you see little references, here and there to these ideas, popping up. in these different passages. But the point is that, so if we try to pull it all together, Moshe, yes, he is particularly a product of the moral heroism and courage and efforts of many different women, and that's a very striking thing about him. What's also true is that in that capacity, he had the opportunity to be a tikkun, a way of repairing something that may have been kind of broken from a previous generation or an earlier generation, where there was this missed opportunity to carry the chain forward in improving the condition of women from the sort of resha, or the wickedness, or the state of nature of this sort of initial condition of humankind, into one that is bound by laws and by kingship and by not just arbitrary laws, but laws that are concerned with Yirat Shamayim, with having awe before the world's creator and his judgment. And so it certainly doesn't exhaust the issue of who Moshe is, but I think that it is quite significant to note about him that a big part of how he's brought into being, and a big part of what cements him as the leader that he's going to become, is that he represents the idea of understanding the greater vulnerability of women in the state of nature without law, and insisting on protecting this vulnerable group from the depredations of those who, of the powerful who seek to take advantage of them. And that is both something that is central to what brought him into being, and also it's a sense in which he and his tribe, Shevet Levi, can redeem a missed opportunity from a previous generation, and really put Am Yisrael on track to be the nation that can continue to teach the whole world about how to move away from a dynamic where might makes right, and the powerful take what they want by force, and turn it into a world where there can be a safe and godly legal structure that's established through a relationship of a whole nation to their creator and judge, that makes it possible for women to occupy a different kind of place.
Thank you very much. Do you have any comments on where, how things developed from that period onwards with regards to women? Is there, you see a continued development in that direction of tikkun in the period following Moshe, or?
Yeah, so I've wondered about this in a few other examples. I think there's some of it, I'm not sure if it's all rolled up in the same discussion. There also is this thing about the difference between Shimon and Levi, because Shimon is the tribe that ultimately becomes the most problematic. There's no bracha for Shevet Shimon in Parshat Vezot HaBracha. Moshe omits them, and it's a prince of Shevet Shimon who is engaging in idol worship with Cosby, this daughter of Moab, at this moment when Pinchas, who's from Shevet Levi, kills them both in a way that now kind of pits Shimon and Levi against each other, and where Levi is acting in this capacity as sort of a police force that is resisting the tendency of Shimon to kind of go off the rails. And so that dynamic seems to be related to this discussion a bit, but I'm not sure I have a clear conclusion from it. And I've also wondered about Benot Tzlafchad, the daughters of Tzlafchad, as another example where there's this encounter with Moshe later in the Torah, where there are these women who love Eretz Israel, and they want their share of Nachala, they want the land, but they're afraid that they're going to lose the land from their tribe because their father, Tzlafchad, was in the sort of camp of Korach and was therefore eliminated. And so there's this negotiation about what should the law be in the case where a man is no longer alive to hold on to his tribal holdings, and like can women inherit? And so this is about law, and it's about the greater vulnerability of women and how to adapt the law to account for that vulnerability. And so I think that maybe that passage as well could be tied in. And I mean, maybe the more obvious example is David and Bathsheba, right? That follows the model more directly of a king who sees a woman that appeals to him and then decides to just take her for himself. But it is interesting, this whole thing he does with Uriah Hitti, where he sends him into battle and tries to create a situation where, without laying a hand against him, you know, David is trying to cut things very finely, right? He's trying to get away with not having actually raised a hand against Uriah, but still creating a situation in which it is kasher for him to take Bathsheba for himself, because Uriah has died by grama, so to speak, by indirect causation. And then Natan, the Navi, comes to David and says, you still did something wrong. You've still done a great sin. Don't think that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is you know, so foolish as to miss the point of what you've done. So I think that certainly if you compare David to Paro or to Abimelech, he is on the one hand showing all of this halachically sensitive caution about how he's handling the situation, because he's not actually just going and killing the guy. And he's also not saying, well, I can just marry the wife of someone else. I have to get rid of him. But on the other hand, he's clearly sort of sinning within the bounds of the law, and ultimately has to repent for that.
In other words, you could argue that David HaMelech was already in a situation where women were acknowledged to, the family was more respect. There was the status of the family and of women was already more established, and therefore he understood that this is the current situation, this is the current status, and the only way he could, under these improved circumstances, the only way he could do it was, like you said, by doing this maneuver.
Yeah, but I don't know. I do wonder, because there's sort of both the issue of whether people feel that they're bound by the law, and also whether there is any kind of law. Because even in the passages with Paro and Avimelech, there is some concept of the idea of marriage, and there's reference made to the notion that had I but known that you were married, of course I wouldn't have done anything. And that may be a lie, and Avram knows that, and so that the whole situation was created because he knew that if he actually said they were married, they would have just killed him, in the same way that David tried to kill Uriah. But maybe you could say that, well, you might have thought that the difference between David and Paro, or David and Avimelech, would seem larger. But David is, you know, in his, I mean, it may be necessary to study that passage very finely to get all the real differences, because he behaves in a very bad way, right? And he acts in many ways like, it seems like Paro would have had Avraham but revealed that he was married to Sarah.
Do you have any comments about looking at bringing a non-pshat interpretation into what David did in order to understand this, even in a historical sense? That in other words, trying to say that David HaMelech was operating on a different level, essentially. In other words, he sinned, not denying the basic meaning of the pshat, but at the same time acknowledging that his motivations were of a higher nature for whatever the reason might be.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think that we always get very few details about situations that are being described in Tanakh, and it seems like there's I think many others have observed that there's a general tendency that Chazal have to push in the unexpected direction with their midrashim. So, we read in Chumash about Ishmael and Esav, and we kind of feel bad for them, and they don't seem so bad. They just seem like a little bit on a different trajectory or something. But then Chazal come in and just talk about, oh, Ishmael, oh, Esav, they were the worst, Rishaim, and all of the idol worship and all of the murderousness and whatever. And they sort of make the trickery of Yaakov or the desire of Sarai Menu to send a mother and her child out into the desert or whatever. They try to redeem those actions. And then for things like for other actions that seem less that seem more forgivable to us. I think they sometimes kind of point out subtext in the opposite way. So if we're talking about the case of David Lamech, I'm not familiar actually with the sources on this. I would have a tendency to think that there must be some from Chazal that would try to kind of rehabilitate David's image or sort of make it more complicated. And of course, if you fill in enough details of the story, you don't know anything about Uriah Hitti, right? Like, who is this guy? Maybe, if the story is that he's actually awful and David is just trying to sort of free Bathsheba from the tyranny of some wicked man, then suddenly the story sounds very different than if you think of Uriah Hitti as this hapless fellow, who was just, eager to fight for David, and David decided to steal something from him. And we don't, I think that the way to put it is, given everything else we know about David, there is something very challenging about what he does with Uriah Hitti, because it does seem on its face to be callous and self-serving. And so you have to wonder, what is the point that the text is trying to point out to us, that sometimes it can be the case that someone can be, a great tzaddik or whatever, and also it can be that they do something that, if you told the story one way, everyone would be inclined to say, oh yeah, well, that's understandable. I mean, what else are you supposed to do in that situation? But if you tell the story a different way, which is also part of the truth, then you see the bright lines and you kind of say, this is still bad, this is still wrong. And so, we have to see that even David, who might have had his reasons, and also, there's a lot of backstory we don't know. When the text wants to tell us about it, it doesn't sugarcoat it, and it doesn't make excuses.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Chag Sameach.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.
If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.